The bitter wind cut across the snow-covered plains like a knife, but Ethan James hardly noticed as he urged his exhausted horse through the growing blizzard. The winter of 1875 had been unforgiving in Colorado territory, and this December storm threatened to be the worst yet. He'd been a fool to delay his return to his ranch outside Silver Peak, but the cattle sale in Denver couldn't wait. "Just a little further, Scout," he murmured to his chestnut gelding, whose breath came in great clouded puffs. The horse trudged forward, its head bowed against the swirling snow. Ethan pulled his wool scarf higher over his nose, squinting through the white void for any sign of the trail. As dusk threatened to rob him of what little visibility remained, something caught his eye, a dark shape against the pristine white, just off the path. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree or perhaps an unfortunate animal. But as Scout carried him closer, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down his spine. "Whoa," he commanded, pulling the reins gently. There, half buried in a snowdrift, lay the unmistakable form of a person. Ethan dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the deep snow as he approached. Kneeling beside the figure, he brushed away the accumulating powder to reveal a woman, her face pale as the snow itself, lips tinged blue. Her dark hair spilled out from beneath a woolen bonnet, and her traveling cloak was wholly inadequate for the harsh Colorado winter. "Miss," Ethan touched her cheek, alarmed by how cold it felt. "Miss, can you hear me?" No response came, but when he pressed his fingers to her neck, he felt a faint pulse. She was alive, but barely. Thoughts raced through his mind. His ranch was still 3 miles away, and the storm was worsening by the minute. Taking her back to town would be impossible. They'd both freeze before making it halfway. "Hold on," he whispered, though he doubted she could hear. "I'm going to get you somewhere warm." With careful movements, Ethan gathered the mysterious woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and alarmingly still. He managed to mount Scout while holding her, settling her across his lap before wrapping his heavy coat around them both. The horse snorted in protest at the additional burden but obeyed Ethan's gentle commands to start moving. The journey seemed endless. The snowfall thickened until Ethan could scarcely see more than a few feet ahead, and he relied on instinct and Scout's sure footing to guide them home. He spoke continuously, partly to keep himself alert and partly to the unconscious woman in his arms. "Almost there," he said, though he wasn't certain if it was true. "My place isn't much, but it's warm and dry. You'll be all right." When the silhouette of his modest ranch house finally emerged from the white curtain of snow, Ethan nearly wept with relief. Scout trudged the final distance to the small stable, and Ethan dismounted awkwardly, still cradling the woman. "I'll be back for you, boy," he promised his horse, knowing he needed to tend to the woman first. The cabin was cold and dark when Ethan shouldered his way inside. He placed the woman gently on his bed before hurrying to light the stove and several oil lamps. As warmth slowly began to fill the room, Ethan returned to her side, uncertain of what to do next. Her clothing was damp with melting snow, which he knew was dangerous. But the propriety of removing a strange woman's clothes gave him pause. "Forgive me, miss," he murmured as he decided necessity outweighed decorum. With careful movements, he removed her frozen cloak and the outer layers of her clothing, replacing them with one of his clean flannel shirts and wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Her boots, he noticed, were thin and worn, hardly suitable for traveling in such weather. As he worked, he took in her features properly for the first time. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with delicate features and dark lashes that stood out starkly against her pale skin. A small scar marked her chin, and her hands, though elegant, showed signs of hard work. With the woman settled as comfortably as possible, Ethan finally returned to care for Scout, unsaddling the faithful horse and providing him with extra feed and a thorough brushing. By the time he returned to the cabin, snow caked on his boots and hat. The stove had warmed the small space considerably. The woman hadn't stirred. Ethan checked her pulse again, relieved to find it stronger than before. He pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for what he suspected would be a long night. "Who are you?" he wondered aloud. And what were you doing out in that storm alone? No luggage, no horse nearby, just a woman in inadequate clothing, miles from anywhere. It made no sense. As the hours passed, Ethan dozed intermittently, waking frequently to check on his patient and add wood to the stove. It was near dawn when a soft moan pulled him instantly from sleep. The woman's eyelids fluttered, and Ethan leaned forward, watching as awareness slowly returned to her face. Her eyes opened fully, revealing irises of the deepest blue he had ever seen. For a moment she stared at the ceiling in confusion. Then, noticing Ethan's presence, she gasped and tried to sit up, only to fall back with a pained groan. "Easy now," Ethan said softly. "You're safe." Where her voice was a hoarse whisper. "Where am I?" "My ranch, about 15 miles west of Silver Peak. I found you half buried in snow during yesterday's storm." Ethan reached for a cup of water he'd kept ready. "Can you drink?" She nodded weakly, and he helped her sit up enough to sip the water. When she'd had her fill, she sank back against the pillows, studying him with wary eyes. "My name is Ethan James," he offered. "I run cattle on this land." She hesitated before responding. Nora Wilson, Miss Wilson." "Can you tell me what happened, how you came to be out there alone?" A shadow passed over her face. "I was traveling to San Francisco, the stagecoach. There was an accident. The wheel broke on the ice." She paused, closing her eyes briefly. "The driver said we couldn't continue. He and the other passengers headed back toward town, but I thought I could make it to the next station. It seemed so close." "That was a dangerous choice," Ethan said, trying to keep judgment from his tone. "I had my reasons," she replied, her voice suddenly guarded. Ethan nodded, sensing she wasn't ready to elaborate. "You should rest. We can talk more later." "Thank you," she whispered, her eyelids already growing heavy, "for saving my life." As she drifted back to sleep, Ethan sat back in his chair, studying her face. Nora Wilson was clearly running from something or someone. In his 12 years on the frontier, he'd learned to recognize that look. Whatever her secrets, they would have to wait. For now, his duty was clear. He would keep her safe until she was strong enough to continue her journey. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of white across the landscape. Ethan moved to the window, watching as the rising sun transformed the snow into a sea of diamonds. He had a feeling that the arrival of Nora Wilson would transform more than just the landscape. 3 days passed before Nora was strong enough to leave the bed for more than a few minutes. During that time, Ethan slept on a pallet by the stove, tended to his livestock, and prepared simple meals they shared in awkward, stilted conversation. She remained guarded, offering little about herself beyond the basic facts. She was 24, originally from St. Louis, and had been heading west to take a position as a schoolteacher. Ethan didn't press for more, though he suspected there was much she wasn't telling him. He, in turn, shared bits of his own life, how he'd come west after the war, worked as a ranch hand until he saved enough to buy this small spread, and lived alone since his partner had died in a flash flood 2 springs ago. On the 4th morning, Ethan returned from feeding the horses to find Nora sitting at his small table, dressed in her own clothes, which he had carefully dried and mended as best he could. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and color had returned to her cheeks. "You're looking better," he observed, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I feel better," she replied. "Mr. James, I cannot impose on your hospitality any longer. If you could direct me to the nearest town, I'll be on my way." Ethan frowned as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "Miss Wilson, the nearest town is Silver Peak, and it's 15 miles through snow that's waist deep in places. Even if you could manage the journey, which I doubt in your condition, there won't be another stagecoach heading west until spring." "Spring," her face paled, "but that's months away." "That's Colorado in winter," he said simply. "The mountain passes are treacherous even for experienced travelers." Nora's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. "I see, then perhaps I could find work in this Silver Peak until travel resumes." Ethan studied her for a moment. "You could. But the town's small and newcomers are noticed. If you're running from something, it might not be the safest choice." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "What makes you think I'm running?" "Experience," he said quietly. And the fact that you're in an awful hurry to reach California despite nearly dying in the attempt. For a long moment, Nora said nothing. Then, with a sigh that seemed to deflate her entire body, she spoke. I'm not a criminal, if that's what you're thinking. Never crossed my mind. Her fingers traced a pattern on the wooden tabletop. I was engaged to be married. A man my father chose, Thomas Caldwell. He owns half the businesses in St. Louis and is twice my age. She looked up at Ethan, defiance in her eyes. I refused him, and my father, he gave me an ultimatum. Marry Thomas or be disowned. So you ran, Ethan concluded. Nora nodded. I had an offer from a school in San Francisco, a fresh start away from my father's influence. Thomas isn't the type to accept rejection gracefully. I fear he may have sent men to bring me back. The pieces fell into place for Ethan. Her determination to continue westward, her reluctance to stay in one place too long. And now you're trapped here until spring. It seems so. She looked around the small cabin, biting her lip. Mr. James, I understand this is an awkward situation, but you can stay, he interrupted. At least until the weather breaks enough for safe travel. I have work to do around the ranch, and it's no trouble having you here. Relief flooded her features, quickly replaced by determination. I insist on earning my keep. I can cook, clean, mend clothing. I'm not afraid of work. Ethan found himself smiling for the first time in days. I don't doubt that, Miss Wilson, and I won't refuse the help. My cooking skills are limited at best. Then we have an arrangement, she said, extending her hand formally. He took it, surprised by the warmth and strength in her grip. We do. As the days stretched into weeks, Ethan and Nora settled into an unexpected rhythm. She proved to be a capable cook, transforming his basic supplies into meals that reminded him of his mother's cooking back in Virginia. In return, he taught her about ranch life, how to tend the small vegetable cellar, care for the chickens he kept for eggs, and recognize the warning signs of approaching storms. December gave way to January, bringing even harsher weather. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and on the worst days, Ethan had to tunnel through drifts just to reach the stable. During these times, they remained indoors, and Ethan discovered Nora had a gift for storytelling. In the evenings, by lamplight, she would recount tales from books she had read or stories she had learned as a child. My mother loved literature, she explained one night as they sat before the stove. She taught me to read when I was barely 4 years old. Father thought it unseemly for a girl to be so educated, but Mother insisted. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman, Ethan commented, whittling a piece of wood that was slowly taking the shape of a bird. Nora's smile was tinged with sadness. She died when I was 16. After that, Father became more controlling. I think he genuinely believed he was protecting me, but you needed freedom, Ethan finished. She looked at him with surprise. Yes, exactly that. As January faded into February, Ethan noticed subtle changes in their interactions. Conversations flowed more easily, silences became comfortable rather than awkward, and he found himself looking forward to the evenings they spent together. He caught himself watching Nora when she didn't notice the way she absently tucked stray hairs behind her ear, the slight furrow in her brow when she concentrated, the rare but radiant smile that transformed her face when something genuinely amused her. It was during a particularly harsh blizzard in mid-February that something shifted between them. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the cabin's windows and driving snow through the smallest cracks in the walls. Ethan had spent hours securing the livestock and ensuring they had enough wood to last the night, returning to the cabin exhausted and chilled to the bone. Nora took one look at him and pushed him toward the stove. "You're half frozen yourself," she scolded, helping him remove his snow-caked coat. "Sit, I've made coffee." Too tired to argue, Ethan sank into a chair, gratefully accepting the steaming mug she pressed into his hands. As he sipped the strong brew, Nora surprised him by moving behind his chair and placing her hands on his shoulders. "What are you? You're all knotted with tension," she said matter-of-factly. "My uncle was a physician. I used to help in his practice sometimes." Before he could protest further, her thumbs pressed into the tight muscles of his shoulders, and Ethan had to stifle a groan of relief. Her touch was firm but gentle, working methodically to ease the ache from his body. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said after a few minutes of silence. "MMM." Ethan was finding it difficult to focus on anything beyond the sensation of her hands. "You mentioned a partner who died. Were you very close?" The question jolted him back to awareness. "Yes, Jack was like a brother to me. We served together during the war. He saved my life at Antietam. Afterward, neither of us had much to go home to, so we came west together." Nora's hands paused briefly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "It was hard," Ethan admitted. "We built this place together, had plans to expand. After he died, I couldn't bring myself to leave, but I haven't had the heart to grow the operation either." Her hands resumed their gentle kneading. "Is that why you live so isolated, because of grief?" The question cut closer to the truth than Ethan was comfortable with. "Partly," he acknowledged, "and partly because I've never been much for crowds. The war cured me of any desire for company beyond what I choose." Nora moved around to face him, her expression thoughtful. "And yet you took in a stranger and have shared your home for nearly 2 months." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. "Not all company is unwelcome," Ethan said quietly. A blush colored Nora's cheeks, and she turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot. "The storm sounds like it's worsening." Ethan let her change the subject, but that night, lying on his pallet by the stove, he found himself acutely aware of her presence in his bed just a few feet away. The realization that he was developing feelings for Nora Wilson was as unexpected as it was unwelcome. Come spring, she would continue her journey west, and he would remain here, alone with his cattle and his memories. It would be foolish, he decided, to allow his heart to follow a path that could only lead to more loss. The following weeks brought warmer days, though nights remained bitterly cold. As the snow began to recede from the southern slopes, Ethan spent more time outdoors, checking fences and preparing for the spring calving season. Nora often accompanied him on these tasks, proving surprisingly adept at outdoor work despite her city upbringing. "My father would be horrified to see me now," she laughed one afternoon as they repaired a chicken coop damaged by the weight of snow. Her cheeks were flushed from exertion, a smudge of dirt across her forehead. "Why's that?" Ethan asked, handing her another nail. "A proper lady doesn't engage in physical labor," she mimicked in a pompous tone. "She certainly doesn't enjoy it, and do you enjoy it?" Nora paused, considering the question seriously. "I do. There's satisfaction in seeing the direct result of your work. In the city, everything was abstract. Here, when something needs fixing, you fix it. When animals need care, you provide it." She looked at him directly. "It's honest work." Ethan nodded, understanding completely. "That's why I came west. After the war, everything back east felt like pretense. Out here, a man is judged by what he does, not who his family is or which side he fought for." "Do you ever miss Virginia?" she asked, returning to her hammering. The question gave him pause. "Sometimes I miss the green of it in summer, the way the hills roll all the way to the horizon. I miss my mother's cooking and the sound of the river near our farm." He shrugged. "But home isn't a place, not really, it's a feeling." "And do you feel at home here?" Her voice was soft, almost lost in the sound of her work. Ethan looked around at the ranch he and Jack had built from nothing. "I did once. After Jack died, it felt emptier." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts. "What about you? Will San Francisco be home?" Nora set down her hammer, her expression troubled. "I don't know. I've never been there. I just know I couldn't stay in St. Louis." "Running from something isn't the same as running toward something," Ethan observed, her eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just that. Sometimes the place we're meant to be isn't where we initially set out to go." Nora studied him for a long moment before returning to her task. "Perhaps you're right, Mr. James." "Ethan," he corrected. "After all this time, I think you can use my given name." A small smile curved her lips. "Ethan, then, and you should call me Nora." "Nora," he repeated, liking the way it felt in his mouth. Something subtle but significant had changed between them, and both felt it, though neither acknowledged it aloud. Early March brought the first real thaw, turning the ranch into a sea of mud and slush. It also brought visitors a rare occurrence that put both Ethan and Nora on edge. Ethan was chopping wood when he heard the approach of horses. Setting down his axe, he moved to the front of the cabin where he had a clear view of the trail leading to his property. Two riders appeared, moving slowly through the mud. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized Sheriff Miller from Silver Peak and tensed instinctively. "Nora," he called through the open door, "stay inside." She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it? Sheriff's coming." "Probably nothing, but it could be about me," she finished, her face going pale. "Do you think Thomas found out where I am?" Ethan wished he could reassure her, but the truth was, a wealthy man like Thomas Caldwell could easily hire men to track down a runaway fiancé. "Let me handle it. If there's trouble, there's a trap door under the rug by the pantry. It leads to a small root cellar. Jack and I built it as a precaution." Nora nodded, slipping back inside. Ethan straightened his shirt and moved to greet the approaching riders. "Sheriff Miller," he called. "Wasn't expecting company." The sheriff, a grizzled man in his 50s with a perpetually stern expression, dismounted with a grunt. "James, been a while. Winter keeps a man busy," Ethan replied noncommittally. "What brings you out this way?" The second rider dismounted as well, a young deputy Ethan had seen around town but didn't know by name. The sheriff gestured toward the cabin. "Mind if we step inside? Been riding since dawn." Ethan hesitated only briefly. "Sure, coffee's hot." Inside, Nora had composed herself, standing near the stove with a pot of coffee ready. She nodded politely to the visitors, her face a careful mask. "This is my friend, Miss Wilson," Ethan introduced her. "She's been staying with me while traveling west." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment on the arrangement. "Madam," he acknowledged with a tip of his hat, "appreciate the coffee." Once they were seated with steaming cups, Sheriff Miller got to the point. "We're looking for a man named Daniel Fletcher. Robbed the Wells Fargo office in Denver about a month back, killed a guard. Trail led west, and we've been checking isolated homesteads. Figured he might try to lay low somewhere remote." Relief washed through Ethan. This wasn't about Nora after all. "Haven't seen any strangers since before Christmas," he said truthfully. "What does this man look like?" Nora asked, her voice steady. The deputy spoke up. "Tall fellow, red hair, beard, has a scar running through his left eyebrow, mean sort." Nora shook her head. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description." Sheriff Miller drained his coffee and stood. "Well, had to check. He's dangerous, so keep your doors locked. And," he hesitated, looking between Ethan and Nora, "might want to make your way into town soon, James. People are starting to talk about your situation here." Heat crept up Ethan's neck. "My situation is my business, Sheriff. Just saying," Miller shrugged. "Small towns have long memories and longer tongues." After the lawman departed, Nora sat heavily at the table. "I've compromised your reputation," she said quietly. "Don't worry about that," Ethan dismissed. "No one in Silver Peak has any say in how I live my life, but they're talking about us." She looked up at him, her blue eyes troubled. "Perhaps I should leave, find somewhere else to stay until the stagecoach runs again." The thought of Nora leaving sent an unexpected pang through Ethan's chest. "And go where? The nearest town with a hotel is 3 days' ride. Besides," he added, attempting a lighter tone, "my reputation was never much to begin with, reclusive rancher who talks to his horses more than people." A small smile flickered across her face. "You don't talk to your horses that much." "You haven't heard my full conversations with Scout," he countered, relieved to see her relax slightly. Nora's smile faded. "Still, the sheriff is right. It isn't proper for me to stay here unchaperoned." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Propriety doesn't count for much out here, Nora. Survival does. And leaving now, with a killer possibly roaming the area and the trails still dangerous, wouldn't be smart." She considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. But perhaps when we next go to town for supplies, we should clarify our arrangement to anyone who asks." "And what exactly is our arrangement?" Ethan asked, suddenly very interested in her answer. Nora blushed, looking away. "That you rescued me and I'm working as your housekeeper until spring. Nothing more." The words "nothing more" hung in the air between them, carrying a weight neither was ready to acknowledge. "Nothing more," Ethan agreed finally, ignoring the hollow feeling in his chest. As March progressed, the weather improved enough for a trip into Silver Peak for supplies. Ethan hitched the wagon early one morning, and he and Nora set out on the muddy trail. She wore her best dress, a navy blue affair that had seen better days, but still spoke of her city upbringing, and had tied her hair back neatly beneath a bonnet. "First time in 2 months I've felt like a proper lady," she joked as they bumped along the rutted trail. Ethan glanced at her, thinking she'd never looked lovelier than she had in his cabin, hair loose around her shoulders, cheeks flushed from cooking over the hot stove. But he kept that thought to himself. "Town's not much," he warned. "One main street, a general store, saloon, small hotel, and a few other businesses. Don't expect San Francisco." Nora laughed, a sound that had become one of his favorites. "I'm not expecting anything grand. Just the novelty of seeing new faces will be enough." Silver Peak proved to be exactly as unimpressive as Ethan had described, a collection of weathered buildings strung along a single muddy street, surrounded by the stunning backdrop of snow-capped mountains. But to Nora, who had seen nothing but Ethan's ranch for months, it might as well have been Paris. They stopped first at the general store, where Ethan introduced Nora to the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, and his wife. The older couple's curious glances were not lost on either of them. "Just passing through, are you, Miss Wilson?" Mrs. Abernathy inquired as she measured out flour. "Yes," Nora replied politely. "I was caught in the December storms while traveling to California. Mr. James was kind enough to offer shelter until the stagecoach runs again." "Very kind indeed," Mrs. Abernathy murmured, her tone suggesting she found it a bit too kind. Ethan, loading supplies onto the counter, pretended not to hear. "When do you expect to continue your journey?" Mr. Abernathy asked, totaling their purchases. "The stage agent in Denver said service to the west would resume in April, weather permitting," Nora answered. "That's only a few weeks away," Mrs. Abernathy observed, looking between Ethan and Nora with undisguised interest. "Yes," Nora agreed, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm most eager to reach San Francisco." Ethan paid for their supplies and loaded them into the wagon while Nora waited outside. As he worked, Mr. Abernathy approached him privately. "James," the storekeeper said in a low voice, "you've always been a decent sort, but people are talking. A young woman staying alone with you all these months." Ethan straightened, fixing the older man with a steady gaze. "Miss Wilson is a lady of impeccable character who found herself in unfortunate circumstances. I've done nothing more than offer shelter to someone in need." "I believe you," Abernathy said, raising his hands placatingly. "But not everyone's as understanding. Just be careful, for her sake as much as yours." Ethan nodded curtly and left the store, irritated by the conversation but knowing the storekeeper meant well. Their next stop was the post office, where Nora hoped to send a letter to the school in San Francisco, explaining her delayed arrival. As she attended to this task, Ethan crossed the street to the livery stable to arrange for his wagon to be serviced. He was discussing the work with the blacksmith when a commotion further down the street caught his attention. 3 men had emerged from the saloon, clearly intoxicated despite the early hour. One of them, a burly fellow with a bushy beard, was pointing toward the post office toward Nora, who was just exiting the building. A sense of foreboding filled Ethan as the men approached her. He abandoned his conversation mid-sentence and strode quickly across the street. "Well now, what have we here?" the bearded man was saying as Ethan drew near. "You must be the schoolmarm James has been keeping out at his place." Nora had drawn herself up with dignity, but Ethan could see the wariness in her posture. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I need to be on my way." "Not so fast, pretty lady," another man slurred, stepping to block her path. "We're just being friendly. Don't get many new faces round here, especially not ones as fine as yours." The lady said, "Excuse me." Ethan's voice cut through the tension as he positioned himself beside Nora. The bearded man sneered. "Well, if it isn't the hermit himself, finally decided to share your little secret with the rest of us." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "Miss Wilson and I are leaving now. Step aside." or what? The third man challenged, swaying slightly. Or I'll move you myself, Ethan replied evenly. The situation might have escalated further if Sheriff Miller hadn't appeared at that moment, drawn by the raising voices. Problem here, gentlemen. He asked, though his stern gaze made it clear he wasn't really asking. The bearded man spat in the dirt. No problem, Sheriff, just welcoming the lady to Silver Peak. Well, your welcome's been noted. Move along now, Miller ordered. The men shuffled off, muttering under their breath. Ethan placed a protective hand on Nora's elbow, guiding her toward their wagon. You all right? He asked quietly. She nodded, though he could feel the slight tremor in her arm. Yes, thank you. The sheriff followed them to the wagon. Sorry about that, Miss Wilson. Henley and his boys get ornery when they drink, which is most days. It's fine, Sheriff, Nora assured him, though her face was pale. Miller turned to Ethan. James, a word. They stepped away from the wagon, and Miller lowered his voice. That Fletcher I mentioned. He was spotted near Red Creek 2 days ago. Killed a trapper who recognized him from the wanted posters. Keep your eyes open and your rifle loaded. Ethan nodded grimly. Appreciate the warning. And the sheriff added, you might want to consider making an honest woman of Miss Wilson before you leave town today. Would save you both a heap of trouble. Before Ethan could respond, Miller tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ethan staring after him in shock. The ride back to the ranch was mostly silent, both Ethan and Nora lost in their own thoughts. The encounter in town had cast a shadow over what should have been a pleasant outing, and the sheriff's parting suggestion weighed heavily on Ethan's mind. As they approached the ranch, Nora finally broke the silence. I'm sorry about what happened in town. It seems I've caused you nothing but difficulty. Ethan glanced at her sharply. That's not true. Those men were drunk and looking for trouble. It had nothing to do with you. But it did, she insisted. If I weren't staying with you, they wouldn't have had reason to confront us. Ethan pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. Nora, listen to me. You have nothing to apologize for, nothing. She met his gaze, her blue eyes troubled. The sheriff suggested we marry, didn't he? I saw your face when he spoke to you. Ethan froze, caught off guard by her directness. For a moment he considered denying it, but the truth was written plainly on his features. He did, he admitted. Because of propriety, she said softly. Yes. Nora looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. And what did you tell him? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Nothing. He walked away before I could respond. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the occasional stamp of the horse's hooves and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. I should check the livestock, Ethan said finally, unable to bear the tension any longer. Been gone most of the day. He climbed down from the wagon and began unloading their supplies, his movements mechanical. Nora remained seated, watching him with an unreadable expression. Ethan, she said at last, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. What would you have said? If the sheriff had waited for your answer, he paused, a sack of flour in his arms, and looked up at her. The afternoon sun caught in her dark hair, giving it auburn highlights he'd never noticed before. In that moment, he wanted nothing more than to tell her the truth, that the idea of her leaving in April filled him with a dread he hadn't felt since the war. That somehow, in the span of a few months, she had brought light back into his solitary existence. Instead, he said, I would have told him that such decisions aren't made for convenience or appearances. They're made because two people can't imagine life without each other. Something flickered in Nora's eyes, disappointment or relief, he couldn't tell. Yes, she agreed quietly, they should be. She climbed down from the wagon and took some of the packages from his arms. I'll start dinner. You see to the animals. As she walked toward the cabin, Ethan was left with the distinct feeling that he'd somehow failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The weeks following their trip to town brought subtle changes to their relationship. Conversations that had once flowed easily became stilted and awkward. Nora spent more time reading or writing letters, while Ethan found reasons to stay outdoors longer than necessary. They circled each other like wary dancers, afraid to step too close. April arrived with a sudden burst of spring weather. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, Wildflowers began to dot the meadows, and birds returned to nest in the eaves of the cabin. With the improved conditions came news the stage coach would resume service to the west in less than a week. Ethan received this information from a passing cattle buyer who stopped at the ranch, and he delivered it to Nora with forced cheerfulness. Good news. You'll be able to continue your journey soon. She looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, her expression carefully neutral. That is good news. I should prepare my things. I'll take you to the stage stop when you're ready, he offered. It's about a day's ride. Thank you, she said, returning her attention to the dough. Ethan lingered in the doorway, wanting to say more but finding no words adequate to express the turmoil in his heart. Finally, he simply nodded and retreated outside, where the open sky didn't feel quite so suffocating. That evening, they ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of utensils against plates and the crackling of the fire in the stove. Ethan found himself memorizing details about Nora, the graceful way she held her fork, the small scar on her chin that he now knew came from falling from a horse as a child, the strand of hair that always escaped her pins to curl against her cheek. When I reach San Francisco, she said suddenly, breaking the silence, I'll send word that I arrived safely. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I'd appreciate that. And perhaps, she hesitated, perhaps we could correspond if you wouldn't mind. I'd like that, he said too quickly. A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. Good. After dinner, Nora announced her intention to retire early. Ethan remained at the table, ostensibly reviewing his cattle records but actually staring at the same page for over an hour, lost in thought. The sound of the cabin door opening startled him from his reverie. Nora stood there, wrapped in her shawl, her expression troubled. I thought you'd gone to bed, he said, rising from his chair. I couldn't sleep, she admitted. I heard something outside and went to check. Ethan, I think there's someone near the stable. All thoughts of their impending separation vanished as Ethan immediately reached for his rifle. Stay here, lock the door behind me. Be careful, she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan slipped outside, moving silently across the yard. The night was clear, a three-quarter moon providing enough light to see by. He approached the stable cautiously, rifle ready, listening intently. A soft noise from inside, not one of his horses, confirmed Nora's suspicion. Someone was definitely in the stable. Ethan positioned himself beside the door, took a deep breath, and then stepped inside quickly, rifle raised. Don't move, he commanded. A figure near Scout's stall spun around, and Ethan found himself facing a tall man with a red beard. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, just as the deputy had described. Daniel Fletcher, the murderer Sheriff Miller had warned them about. Fletcher's hand moved toward his holster, but Ethan was quicker. Touch that gun and it'll be the last thing you do. The outlaw froze, eyes calculating. Easy now, friend, just looking for a place to rest. You're no friend of mine, Fletcher, Ethan replied coldly. Sheriff Miller's been hunting you since that guard died in Denver. A flicker of surprise crossed Fletcher's face, quickly replaced by a dangerous smile. Well now, seems my reputation precedes me, but you've got a problem. You can't watch me all night, and I don't intend to hang. You're not leaving this stable except in custody, Ethan stated firmly. Fletcher's grin widened. Then I guess we're at an impasse. Unless you're planning to shoot an unarmed man. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for a sound that chilled Ethan's blood, the cabin door opening. Nora had disobeyed his instruction to stay inside. Fletcher noticed Ethan's momentary distraction and seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, knocking the rifle barrel aside. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the stable roof as the two men grappled. Fletcher was taller and heavier, but Ethan had the strength born of daily physical labor. They crashed into Scout's stall, causing the horse to rear in panic. Ethan. Nora's voice came from the stable entrance. Stay back, he shouted, just as Fletcher's fist connected with his jaw, sending him staggering. The outlaw took advantage of Ethan's momentary weakness to draw his pistol. But before he could aim, a gunshot cracked through the air. Fletcher jerked, a look of surprise crossing his face as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. He crumpled to the ground, his unfired pistol falling from limp fingers. Ethan turned to see Nora standing in the doorway, his spare revolver clutched in both hands, her face ashen in the moonlight. "Nora," he breathed, moving quickly to her side. He gently took the gun from her trembling hands. "Are you all right?" She nodded mutely, her gaze fixed on Fletcher's still form. "Is he?" Ethan checked briefly. "Yes, he's gone." A shudder ran through her body, and suddenly she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. Ethan pulled her against his chest, holding her tightly as she wept. "I thought he was going to kill you," she whispered against his shirt. "I couldn't stay in the cabin, not knowing." "You saved my life," Ethan said softly, stroking her hair, "but you could have been killed." Nora pulled back slightly to look up at him. "I couldn't let that happen, not to you." "Not when she stopped abruptly, as if catching herself. "Not when you what?" Ethan prompted, his heart suddenly racing. Instead of answering, Nora reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against the bruise already forming on his jaw. Then, with a boldness that surprised them both, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief, just the softest touch of her mouth against his, but it changed everything. When she pulled away, her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "I couldn't let him hurt you," she said simply. "Not when I love you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Ethan stared at her, scarcely believing what he'd heard. "You love me," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. Nora nodded, a blush spreading across her cheeks. "I do. I know it's foolish, and I've tried not to," but Ethan silenced her with a kiss of his own, deeper and more certain than hers had been. His arms tightened around her waist, drawing her closer as she melted against him, her hands sliding up to twine around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "I've been fighting it for weeks," he confessed. "The thought of you leaving. It's been tearing me apart." "Then ask me to stay," she whispered. Ethan pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. "You have dreams, Nora. San Francisco teaching. I can't ask you to give that up for a hard life on a small ranch. Dreams change," she said simply. "When I left St. Louis, I was running away from something I didn't want. Now I've found something I do want." She touched his face again, her eyes filled with certainty. "You, this place, the life we could build together." Ethan's heart soared at her words, but caution tempered his joy. "Are you sure?" "Ranch life isn't easy, especially for a woman used to city comforts." Nora laughed softly. "Have these past months looked easy to you? I've hauled water, chopped vegetables, mended clothing by lamplight, and just now shot a man to protect what matters to me. I'm stronger than I appear, Ethan James." "That you are," he agreed, a smile spreading across his face. "Nora Wilson, will you stay? Will you marry me?" Her answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and a future neither had dared imagine until now. Morning found them sitting side by side on the cabin porch, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink. Fletcher's body, wrapped in a tarp, lay in the wagon, ready to be transported to Silver Peak. The events of the night had left them both too keyed up to sleep, and they'd talked until dawn, planning their future together. "Sheriff Miller will be surprised when we arrive with Fletcher," Nora remarked, her head resting against Ethan's shoulder. "Not as surprised as when we ask him to marry us afterward," Ethan replied, kissing the top of her head. Nora laughed, the sound full and joyous in the morning air. "Mrs. Abernathy will be scandalized." "Let her be," Ethan said. "Though I suspect she'll be more disappointed to lose the best gossip Silver Peak has had in years." Their laughter mingled together, rising toward the brightening sky, the first of many such mornings they would share in the years to come. True to their plan, they delivered Fletcher's body to Sheriff Miller, who was indeed surprised but grateful that the dangerous outlaw would no longer threaten the region. When Ethan announced their intention to marry immediately, the sheriff merely smiled knowingly and directed them to the small church at the end of the street. The ceremony was simple, witnessed only by the sheriff and the young deputy who had accompanied him to Ethan's ranch months before. Nora wore her blue dress with wildflowers Ethan had picked on the journey to town woven into her dark hair. Ethan had shaved carefully and donned his one good shirt, the same he'd worn for Jack's funeral, though he kept that detail to himself. "Do you, Ethan James, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked, his weathered face solemn. "I do," Ethan answered without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Nora's. "And do you, Nora Wilson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she replied, her voice clear and certain. As they exchanged simple gold bands purchased hastily from the general store, Ethan felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The loneliness that had been his constant companion since Jack's death faded away, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more precious. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Their kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their small audience but no less meaningful for its restraint. When they parted, Nora's eyes shone with unshed tears of happiness. "Mrs. James," Ethan murmured, testing the name on his tongue. "I like the sound of that," she whispered back. They spent one night at the small hotel in town, their wedding night, before returning to the ranch the following day. As they approached the cabin, now their shared home in truth as well as practice, Ethan surprised Nora by pulling the wagon to a halt and coming around to her side. "What are you doing?" she laughed as he lifted her into his arms. "Carrying my bride across the threshold," he explained, walking toward the cabin door. "It's tradition." "We've never been much for tradition," she teased, but her arms tightened around his neck. "Some traditions are worth keeping," Ethan replied, pushing the door open with his shoulder and carrying her inside. Later, as they lay together in what was now truly their bed, Nora traced lazy patterns on Ethan's chest. "I was so afraid that day in the snow," she confessed softly. "I thought I was going to die alone in a strange place, with no one to even know my name." Ethan caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "And I thought I was doomed to live alone, with nothing but memories for company." "It seems we saved each other," she observed. "That we did," he agreed, pulling her closer. "And we'll keep doing so every day." As spring gave way to summer, Ethan and Nora settled into married life with a naturalness that surprised them both. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, Nora's practical city education complementing Ethan's hands-on experience. They expanded the vegetable garden, added more chickens, and began planning improvements to the cabin for the coming winter. In late June, they made another trip to town, this time to send letters announcing their marriage to Nora's friends in St. Louis and to the school in San Francisco, politely declining their teaching position. They also purchased supplies for the improvements. They planned additional lumber for a second room, glass for another window, paint for the exterior. "You're really fixing the place up," Sheriff Miller commented when he encountered them loading their wagon. "Planning to stay a while, are you?" Ethan smiled, his arm around Nora's waist. "For good, Sheriff. We've decided to make a real go of this ranch." The older man nodded approvingly. "Glad to hear it. This territory needs more family men and fewer drifters." As they prepared to leave, Mr. Abernathy approached with a package. "Wedding gift," he explained gruffly, handing it to Nora. "From the wife and me. She said every new home needs one." Inside was a beautiful quilt, hand-stitched in a pattern of stars against a deep blue background. Nora's eyes filled with tears as she ran her fingers over the intricate needlework. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Please thank Mrs. Abernathy for us." The storekeeper nodded, clearly pleased by her reaction. "She'll be glad you like it. Says you're welcome at our Sunday dinners anytime you're in town." This simple acceptance into the community meant more to both Ethan and Nora than either had expected. As they drove home, the quilt carefully stowed among their other purchases, they discussed what it meant to truly belong somewhere. "I never thought I'd find a home again after I left St. Louis," Nora admitted. "I thought San Francisco would be just another place to exist." Ethan understood completely. "After the war, I felt rootless. Even building this ranch with Jack, part of me was just going through the motions." "And now," she prompted. He glanced at her, his love plainly written on his face. "Now I understand what home really means." Summer passed in a blur of hard work and quiet contentment. They added the second room to the cabin, painted the exterior a warm yellow at Nora's suggestion, and planted a small orchard of apple trees that wouldn't bear fruit for years, but represented their commitment to the future. In August, a letter arrived from St. Louis that brought unexpected news. Nora's father had suffered a stroke and, facing his mortality, wished to reconcile with his daughter. The letter, written by her aunt, pleaded for Nora to consider returning to make peace. "What will you do?" Ethan asked after she showed him the letter. Nora sat quietly for a long moment, weighing the past against the present. "I should go," she said finally. "Not because he deserves forgiveness, but because I don't want to carry this bitterness forever." Ethan nodded, understanding her decision even as anxiety flickered through him. "I'll go with you," she looked up at him, surprised. "You would leave the ranch. What about the cattle? Miller's nephew has been looking for work. He could watch things for a few weeks." Ethan took her hand in his. "You're more important than any ranch, Nora. Besides, I should meet my father-in-law, don't you think?" Relief and gratitude flooded her face. "Yes, I'd like that very much." They made arrangements quickly, booking passage on the eastbound stage the following week. The journey to St. Louis was long and uncomfortable, but they entertained each other with stories and speculations about what awaited them in the city. "Will Thomas Caldwell still be angry, do you think?" Ethan asked as their steamboat chugged up the Mississippi. Nora shrugged, watching the shoreline pass. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he's found another young woman to control. Men like Thomas always do." Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders. "If he causes trouble, he won't," she assured him. "Not once he sees I'm happily married," she smiled up at him. "Very happily married, St. Louis appeared on the horizon like something from another world, its buildings taller and more numerous than anything in Silver Peak, its streets bustling with a population that dwarfed their entire county in Colorado. Nora watched the city approach with mixed emotions, pointing out landmarks to Ethan, who had never traveled this far east since the war. Her father's house, more of a mansion, really stood in one of the city's finest neighborhoods. As their hired carriage pulled up to the imposing structure, Ethan let out a low whistle. "You grew up here?" he asked, eyeing the columned entrance and manicured grounds. Nora nodded, suddenly nervous. It never felt like home, though, just a beautiful cage. They were greeted at the door by Nora's Aunt Martha, a thin woman with kind eyes that brightened considerably when she saw Nora. "My dear girl," she exclaimed, embracing her niece tightly. "Thank heaven you've come, and this must be your husband." She extended her hand to Ethan, who took it gently. "Ethan James, madam, pleased to meet you." Martha led them inside, explaining in hushed tones that Nora's father was much changed by his illness, weaker physically but perhaps softer in spirit as well. "He speaks of you often, Nora. I believe he truly regrets his harshness." Nora nodded, though Ethan could feel the tension in her body as they approached her father's bedroom. He squeezed her hand reassuringly before she entered, staying respectfully in the hallway to give them privacy for their reunion. The conversation was long, and when Nora emerged, her eyes were red from crying, but a weight seemed to have lifted from her shoulders. "He wants to meet you," she told Ethan. Edward Wilson was indeed a shadow of the domineering figure Nora had described. Propped against pillows in a massive four-poster bed, his right side visibly weaker than his left, he regarded Ethan with keen eyes that reminded him of Nora's. "So," the older man said, his voice slightly slurred but intelligible, "you're the man who married my daughter." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied respectfully. "Rancher, she tells me, in Colorado." "That's right. Small place, but it's growing." Edward studied him for a long moment. "She says she's happy, happier than she ever was here." Ethan met the man's gaze steadily. "I hope that's true, sir." "I do my best to make it so." A hint of a smile touched the older man's lips. "Good, that's good." He shifted his attention to Nora, who stood at Ethan's side. "Your mother would have liked him, I think." Tears welled in Nora's eyes at the unexpected concession. "I think so too, father." They stayed in St. Louis for 3 weeks, during which Edward's health improved enough for him to join them for short dinners in the formal dining room. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing about their life in Colorado. though he clearly found it difficult to imagine his city-raised daughter thriving in such conditions. "You really milk the cows yourself?" he asked incredulously one evening. Nora laughed, exchanging a glance with Ethan. "Only one cow, father, and yes, every morning." Edward shook his head in wonder. "Your mother's daughter through and through, always more capable than anyone gave her credit for." On their final night in St. Louis, Edward made an unexpected announcement. "I've had my lawyer draw up some papers," he said, handing an envelope to Nora. "A wedding gift long overdue." Inside was a deed to a significant parcel of land adjacent to their ranch land Ethan had often admired but could never have afforded, along with a bank draft that made Nora's eyes widen. "Father, this is too much," she protested. Edward waved away her objection. "It's less than you deserve and far less than the dowry I would have provided had I not been such a stubborn old fool." He looked at Ethan directly. "Take care of her and of my grandchildren when they come." Ethan nodded solemnly. "You have my word, sir." The journey back to Colorado felt different somehow. They were returning not just to their ranch, but to possibilities that hadn't existed before: the chance to expand their operation, to build something truly sustainable for the future. "What will you do with the land?" Nora asked as their train clattered westward. Ethan considered the question carefully. "Raise more cattle, certainly, but I've been thinking, with the railroad expanding, there's going to be more demand for good horses. We could start a breeding operation focusing on quality stock." Nora's eyes lit up with interest. "I've always loved horses, and with the extra funds we could build a proper stable, maybe hire some help." They spent the remainder of the journey planning and dreaming, their excitement growing with each mile that brought them closer to home. Autumn came to Colorado in a blaze of color: aspen trees turning golden against the evergreen backdrop, days growing shorter, nights crisper. The expanded ranch, now nearly 3 times its original size thanks to Edward Wilson's gift, kept Ethan and Nora busier than ever. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload and began construction on a larger stable to house the breeding horses they planned to acquire in the spring. The cabin, too, underwent transformation. With Nora's careful management of their newfound resources, they added a proper kitchen, a small parlor, and even a guest room. The original structure remained the heart of their home, the place where they had first come to know and love each other. In late October, as the first snow dusted the highest peaks, Nora confirmed what Ethan had begun to suspect: they were expecting a child in the early summer. "Are you happy about it?" she asked nervously after sharing the news. Ethan's answer was to lift her off her feet and spin her around, his face alight with joy. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he assured her, setting her down gently and placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "A baby, our baby." Nora covered his hand with her own. "I never imagined this life for myself, you know. When I left St. Louis, I was just running away with no real plan beyond escape. And I never imagined loving anyone again after losing Jack," Ethan admitted. "I thought I'd live out my days alone with my cattle and my memories." "It's strange how life surprises us," she mused. "If that stagecoach wheel hadn't broken, if you hadn't found me in the snow—" "I would have found you somehow," Ethan said with certainty. "One way or another, we were meant to be together." As winter settled over the ranch once more, bringing back memories of their first days together, Ethan often thought about the sequence of events that had brought Nora into his life. A broken wheel, a desperate decision, a snowstorm, small things, really, in the grand scheme of the world. Yet they had changed everything. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after he had found her half frozen in the snow, Ethan and Nora sat before their fire, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly where their child slumbered. "Do you ever wonder about coincidences?" he asked quietly. Nora tilted her face up to his. "What do you mean?" "Just thinking about all the things that had to happen exactly as they did for us to be here now. Sometimes it seems like more than chance." She smiled, understanding his meaning. "My mother used to say that love is the only real magic in the world, that it finds a way even against impossible odds." Ethan nodded, pulling her closer. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was, Nora agreed, snuggling against him. And she would have loved you and this place, and the life we've built. Outside, snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting past their window no longer a threat, but a reminder of the beauty that can come from the harshest circumstances. Inside, warmed by the fire and each other, Ethan and Nora James watched the snow and counted their blessings, secure in the knowledge that they had found not just shelter but true belonging in each other's arms. Come spring, their son would be born a sturdy boy they would name Jack, in honor of the friend whose absence had first created the space for Nora in Ethan's life. 2 years later, a daughter would join their family, followed by another son. The ranch would prosper, eventually becoming one of the most respected horse breeding operations in Colorado. Silver Peak would grow into a proper town, with Ethan serving several terms as mayor and Nora establishing its first school. But on this winter night, with memories of their beginning fresh in their minds, they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds. A cowboy who had discovered a half-frozen woman in the snow, carried her home, and stayed until she woke. And in waking, she had awakened him as well to a life neither had dared to dream possible. "I love you, Nora James," Ethan whispered into her hair, "and I love you," she replied, her voice carrying the warmth of absolute certainty. "Now and always."